This is a video about painting the horse. I put this together because over the years I've been asked by a number of people for suggestions about how to approach using the horse form in their work and how to solve some formal problem solving as they paint the horse in their work, but also for anybody who's interested in how the horse has been used throughout art history, or if you're just interested in horses in general. I think you'll find our video interesting. We're going to look at some very important artists throughout art history and how they have handled using the horse form in their work. And we're also going to pay special attention to particular horse breeds because the horse form itself has changed significantly over time, and therefore how these artists have articulated breeds that were contemporary to the artists we're going to look at has changed significantly. So, for instance, if we look at the work of Frederick Remington, who was the high drama, high action painter of the Old West and the frontier, one of them, and the subject of his works was the Spanish Mustang, this small-statured, narrow-bodied little horse, very different conformationally than the modern-day quarter horse that we see on working ranches today or in Western competitions, that is therefore depicted as a subject in contemporary Southwestern art or Western art today. We'll also look at the work of Piero Uccello, who was the Florentine painter in the 15th century, who was the first artist attributed with depicting the horse form in a three-dimensional way on a two-dimensional surface. And we'll look at a couple of other Renaissance artists and what motivated them to use the horse form in their work. We'll also look at a couple of contemporary female artists, Susan Rothenberg and Debra Butterfield, who both used the horse form in their work as a stand-in for the figure so that they could, for different reasons, avoid using the direct form, the figurative form. And they have said in both of their cases that their works are self-portraits and the horse was a metaphor for themselves. We'll look at both of them. And in the case of Susan Rothenberg, she only did the horse form, only focused on the horse form for about a 5-year period in the late 1970s and never intended for the works to be shown, but they were eventually shown and were met with such strong critical acclaim that they defined her career, and she is known to have said that she's now known as a damn horse painter. Her statement reflects her awareness that the art world generally does not look terribly favorably on using the horse form in your work. And I believe that's really primarily due to the fact that a lot of artists use the horse form as a subject when they are expressing kind of a sentimental approach to an individual horse, or as an opportunity to render. And while those elements can be assets in an artist's work, if it stops at that and doesn't go beyond that, you run the risk of having the work be not just sort of surface and not a personal exploration for you as an artist, but also almost as an evasive element to avoid doing more personal work with paintings or even using the horse form. When we look at the development of civilization, the horse has played such an important role. Battles have been won, whether one side of a battle had a particular horse breed, let alone horses at all, and horses have been central in transportation and agriculture. So there's a good chance that generations of your family have had horses play a central role for them, and as a person, I think there's a good chance that there are more layered meanings for the horse form for each of us that can be explored if you're interested in using the horse form. You as an artist are going to connect much more strongly to your work when you're willing to really find out what you as an individual connects with regard to visual form that is uniquely you. And other people then will have a chance of connecting with your work more strongly also, because remember, we really rely on memory and emotional connections with memory for viewers to connect with our work and for ourselves to connect with visual form and what these elements of visual form mean to each of us. When we look throughout our timeline, there's very few examples of artists who have used the horse as an opportunity to render a particular individual animal, except for maybe in England in the 1800s when there were a lot of portraits of race horses as a display of wealth. But and when we look at figurative portraiture as well, it's very rarely about the individual person. It's almost always about the human experience, and that's why we connect with those works when we don't necessarily know the individual that is the subject of the work. So think about those things as we go through our timeline. And with that, I'm going to get started.
Welcome to Picture of the Horse, an educational video about the use of the horse form in art. We're going to start by looking at a couple of the oldest horse breeds. I'm not going to go too much in depth on these two breeds, but I am going to reference them throughout the slideshow, so I wanted to point them out, what they look like. If you are involved with horses or if you're in equestrian, you'll know the breed on the left right away. This is the Arabian horse. They have some very distinct characteristics, this high kind of S-shaped curve to their head carriage and neck, and this what they call kind of a dish face, kind of concave facial profile. They have actually one less vertebrae in their back and this very flat croup, a high tail carriage, and very refined bones. The Arabian horse has been crucial in the development of the modern thoroughbred, as has the Barb horse here on the right. The Barb horse is kind of this small, sturdy little creature. He has been attributed, though native to North Africa, the Barb horse has been attributed with giving the Moors the victory over the Spaniards in the early 8th century on the Iberian Peninsula. Now, the reason that that's important is because prior to the Barbs being brought by the Moors to the Iberian Peninsula, the native Iberian horses were thought to be the superior war horse, so much so that the Phoenicians and the Celts and the Romans and the Greeks all thought of them as the quintessential war horse. For that reason, the original Iberian horses made their way into Greek and Roman art almost exclusively. You see the original Iberian characteristics, that thick neck, high head carriage, high stepping horse. We're going to see here reflected in the more contemporary breed of the Lusitano. So this is a little complicated breed, so I want to make sure that I outline some of the characteristics of the breed because they were so influential when it comes to Greek and Roman art, Renaissance art, and Baroque art, and all of these movements where you see this horse. We think of this classical horse look. As you can see, this contemporary Lusitano horse his name is Chamorro, by the way. He's owned by a friend of mine, Jill McRae, and he has this very classic look of this thick, heavy muscling in his neck and the convex lower part of his face. They have a larger kind of jowl area, and then they have kind of almost a triangular shape to their face. They're a slightly smaller breed than the thoroughbred breed, although in recent years they've been bred to increase their size to meet the European aesthetic. In England and in Germany, for example, some of the sporting breeds, but they have this very muscular neck and this tucked head. They keep in their gestures. Often you see this reflected in Roman art, in Greek art. Again, we'll look at some examples of that. They also have this high stepping gait. And the original Iberian horses were then bred in Andalusia with the Barb horses that the Moors brought, because it was thought, again, that the victory was given to the Moors by the Barb horses and their superior agility or strength or whatever it was on the battlefield that gave them the upper edge. So from that point on, the Spaniards got smart and said, I'm going to breed this Barb horse into this Iberian native horse, and they ended up with the Lusitano and the Andalusian. It was actually all under the name Andalusian until the 1960s when the stud book had split. So if you're familiar with that kind of horse breed, you'll know that there are some different characteristics between the Lusitano and the Andalusian, but a lot of mostly similarities. There is some slightly different conformation in the croup area and sometimes in their facial features, but very similar. Again, this is a Lusitano horse, a gelding, and this is also a Lusitano. This is Urano VO. He is a muse of mine. You may have seen him show up in a lot of my work, but he's changed in color. If you've seen some of my pieces where I use him as the model, a lot of those pieces he's a darker gray. He was a very dark dappled gray when he was younger. Lusitanos often change color throughout their lifetime, significantly actually, and he's become less dappled. You can't see really any trace of the dapples unless you look at his coat right under the bright sun. But they again have this very full muscular croup area and a rounded barrel. We're going to contrast that with the thoroughbred horse because thoroughbreds are more sculpted in their conformation. The Lusitano has a very muscular, broad shoulder. Well, we'll see this reflected in Da Vinci's work and his drawings. And again, they have generally this convex lower part of their facial profile. They have very full manes and tails too, although Urano's mane is on the opposite side of his neck in this photo. This is the artist I mentioned in the introduction, Paolo Uccello, who was the Florentine painter attributed with depicting the horse form in a three-dimensional way for the first time on a two-dimensional surface. He's also been given the credit for creating perspective in two-dimensional works for the first time. But the Renaissance period was a time when sculpture and monumental works was much more popular than painting, and he referenced monumental horse forms as references for understanding how light created the illusion of dimension. And you can kind of see he's got these horses that look like they're little monuments kind of plopped into the battle scene here. And this, of course, is a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci. And again, you see, if you saw an Andalusian horse standing in front of you, you'd see almost these exact same lines to their hindquarters. Again, this rounded barrel, these very muscular, broad sloping shoulders, muscular legs, and this very thick arching neck. These drawings were studies for monumental works. Leonardo was often working out the engineering of how he was going to do these sculptural works. Very, very interested in anatomy, dissecting cadavers to get at what the muscles and the science behind the depiction of form. This is Peter Paul Rubens, and he's a Renaissance and Baroque painter painted during the Renaissance and Baroque periods. And he was the first attributed with really getting the sense of movement into these battle scenes with these horses. And as you can see again, his horse has this full mane, full tail, this kind of convex part of the lower part of his face, the large eyes, the broad shoulders, the white color, the high reaching legs. I mean, very Andalusian looking horse, very Iberian looking horse in this battle scene. And of course, this sense of luminance that Peter Paul Rubens was working out in his works was very, very influential in the Baroque period with other Baroque artists like Caravaggio, who was working out this very dramatic chiaroscuro lighting. So next we're going to look at the thoroughbred horse. And the thoroughbred is kind of a modern breed developed in England in the 17th century. They were first developed and bred by using the native mares in England and breeding them with 3 different stallions. So every purebred modern thoroughbred can trace their bloodlines back to one of these 3 stallions: the Goliphan Arabian, the Brierly Turk, and the Darley Arabian, and they all were the primary sires to these native mares that developed this contemporary thoroughbred horse, which was first designed as a sporting horse and is still now known primarily as a racing horse. So we see the thoroughbred breed showing up in all of these portraits of horse racing. Even contemporary horse racing now are thoroughbred horses. There are quarter horses that race, but when we think of the quintessential racehorse painting, we are thinking about that conformation of the thoroughbred racehorse. What makes the characteristic of the thoroughbred unique and different from the breeds we've talked about so far is they have the lower head carriage and a straighter neck. They sometimes have a little concave line to the crest of their neck, and they have a very flat profile to their face, very large eyes, larger, very beautifully sculpted heads, and also one of the defining characteristics are these protruding veins and arteries in their face. They're also a fairly large breed. Our model here is Tag. He's actually a quarter horse thoroughbred mix, but conformationally you see very little characteristics of a quarter horse in this particular horse. He has the protruding withers, which are very much a thoroughbred characteristics, and then this partial triangle, lower head carriage neck, again the larger head, and then the thoroughbreds tend to have a little bit smaller feet and the sculpted body, and then they also have a somewhat sloping croup, not nearly as much as you see in the quarter horse, however, and then again they're quite tall, often about 17 hands, 16 to 17 hands. This is part of the European aesthetic of the horse, these taller horses, and in fact at one point it was so amplified that King Henry VIII slaughtered every horse under 13 hands, a pretty horrible thing to do for a dislike of a short horse. So when we see the thoroughbred horse used, we see it most prominently come up over and over again in horse racing art, because this is what, again, the breed was used for, and in some of these really staged portraits of horse racing scenes where we see the painting kind of done as a display of wealth. This particular artist, Benjamin Marshall, started out doing figures, human figure portraiture, and then turned to doing equine portraiture in his early 20s, and ended up doing about 60 of these fairly rendered portraits of racehorses and their owners, and then his paintings were engraved and published in sporting magazines. He was a follower of George Stubbs, who was another prominent equine painter, but we see this over and over again throughout this period. This is 1799, 1700s, 1800s, where again these were depictions of the ideal horse breed to display their wealth. Now this is a breed, draft horse breed. This is a Percheron horse, and I chose him because he's a very classical example of the Percheron horse. This is Windermere's Navigation, this particular subject, owned by Windermere Farms, and they are a prominent breeder of Percheron horses, so he is a very typical Percheron conformation, but they're quite tall. 18 hands is not unusual for a Percheron horse. They're have very thick necks, tend to be gray or black. They have high head carriage. One of the defining characteristics about this breed is they tend to have kind of sparse manes and tails. But they were originally developed in France, in Western France in the 17th century, designed as a war horse, but became much more popular as coach horses and in agriculture. The image on the left is a castle fairly local to me. If you know the Fox Valley area west of Chicago, there's a little town by the name of Wayne, and there's one prominent structure on the corner of Kirk and Army Trail Road, the main intersection in the Wayne area. And Wayne now today is a very equestrian community. There's a hunt there. They have a couple of different horse show grounds and a lot of horse properties. And this history goes back to this particular fellow, Mark Dunham, who in the late 1800s had the foresight to import these Percheron horses for agricultural purposes. This was a good idea. He got rich and famous doing this and succeeded all the way up until World War I, when an embargo was placed on the export of the Percheron horse to the United States because they needed them on the battlefield in Europe, and then also because during that same time period we saw mechanization in farming. But he was so successful, the first one to import these Percherons, so successful that the Percheron is now makes up 70% of all the draft horses in the United States. But I wanted to include them in the show because one of my favorite works of art, this piece Horse Fair by Rosa Bonheur, who is a French painter, is one of my absolute favorite works of art and clearly uses the Percheron breed as the subject of her work. She's taken advantage of these contrasting colors. They're usually gray or black, as I said. And so she's taken advantage of this beautiful high contrasting colors of these different horses, this wonderful opportunity to describe form and muscles and action, and this very dynamic scene of this horse fair. This is an enormous painting. It's 16.5 feet, and this was painted in 1853. Next, we're going to look at another favorite artist of mine. This is Frederick Remington, and you can see his mount is nothing like the Percheron horse we just looked at. Actually, he's riding a Spanish Mustang, and the reason that that's really important is because you see the same conformation of this same horse repeated over and over again in Remington's work. This is a Nez Perce Indian woman from Idaho on the right, and they were attributed with creating this Nez Perce horse, which is out of the Spanish Mustang, and you see the same kind of head carriage, the same kind of conformation. They're a relatively small statured horse. They have a relatively narrow bone structure, hardy, and have a lot of endurance. And they were the horses, these Spanish Mustangs, the conquistadors brought back over to North America. I say back over because their ancestors were originally from North America. These horses' ancestors were, but these were the horses that were bred by using the Barb horse in Andalusia and those original Iberian horses to create the superior war horse. He doesn't really look much like it, but they're smart and sure-footed and very adapting. So now we're going to look at another work of Frederick Remington's. Again, we see this same reiterated conformation of these horses. Again, in contrast with some, not only other works we've seen in the past in the slideshow, but also some we're going to look at with examples of contemporary Southwestern work, because the contemporary quarter horse, which we haven't gotten to yet, is a much different horse, has quite a different conformation than we see in these frontier works by Frederick Remington. This is another favorite piece of mine. I love Frederick Remington. As you can see, I've put 3 of his slides in this show, but this particular piece is the 4th Troopers moving the led horses from 1890. And again, you see this high drama scene, and you see these horses being very expressive, their gaping mouths, and charging across the desert. One of the reasons I wanted to do this slideshow is because so many of the important works of art throughout art history, especially American works of art, you see these very expressive depiction of horses. And I think something's been lost in a lot of the contemporary works today. People looking for work that's easy to live around has kind of lost that. I love very expressive work anyway, and you look back and you see these very emotional, expressive works of Remington and Charles Marion Russell, which we're going to look at here. This is Smoke of a 45 from 1908. But these were expressive horses. This is a dynamic scene. It's a political statement. It's a current narrative work of art. It uses the horse as a narrative tool. These are not mild-mannered portrait paintings or sentimental paintings of the horse. These artists were using horses to describe the scene of the day, what was happening in the streets. Now, one of my relatives, as you know, Gutzon Borglum, I remember looking through a diary, the writings of a diary out of Gutzon Borglum's writings. When he was a young man, he and Solon, of course, both depicted scenes of the Old West, and their father was a physician, and so Gutzon would often go with his father into the town or go on these medical calls, and as he was waiting for his dad, he would sit outside and draw the cowboys as they were in the street. So a lot of his drawings were very much what he was seeing in front of him in his daily life. So I wanted to include a couple pieces of Civil War art. The Morgan horse was the breed that was used primarily by both sides of the battle. This is a scene called The Last Meeting Between General Lee and Jackson by J.G. Fay. It dates from 1877, and the scene shows these 2 different generals on their horses. The horse on the left is Little Sorrel, General Jackson's horse, and the horse on the right is Traveler, General Lee's horse. Traveler was actually a saddlebred, and saddlebreds are known for their high head carriage, but he has definitely taken the license to elongate the horse's legs, and this the Morgan is painted obviously a little more, giving him the benefit of the doubt when you compare him to his actual photograph. And this, again, the actual picture of Traveler, he doesn't have this quite accentuated head carriage that you see in the painting. So a lot of these paintings, of course, the objective was political, or to paint the horses and the generals in this very statuesque, powerful manner, in this expressive way. This is a Winslow Homer piece, and Winslow Homer was an illustrator. He did a lot of work for Harper's Weekly. Harper's Weekly was an illustrated news magazine that was very widely read, very prominent, premier news magazine. He was embedded into the Union Army to do these illustrations, and he did a number of them over the years from the time he was 25 years old. Quite a dangerous job, you might imagine. And you can see these, again, these very high energy, dramatic scenes with these horses, very expressive horses. These are not the placid, decorative depictions of a horse, nor are they portraits of individual horses. These are political illustrations done for narrative purposes to inform the public of what's happening with this civil war that they were involved in. This is a work of Edward Maybridge, Horse in Motion, from 1878. He, of course, was working out the early problem solving for motion pictures. This is chromatography, all these stills he's putting together to show the actual leg movement of the horse as he gallops along. Now, what's funny is you look at these and you compare them to some of those early paintings of horse racing art before the camera came along, and you see how the horse's legs are nowhere in the right position for what they actually are when the horse is running. So this was a big step forward in understanding the motion of the horse, and also the early steps of the development of motion pictures. So this is Romeo. He's my model for a quarter horse. I actually met him in my neighborhood. He and his owner, Nicole Morrow, were riding through my neighborhood one day, and I kind of tracked him down, chased him around with my car, scared her a little bit. But I really was, when I saw him, I thought, oh my gosh, there is the quintessential quarter horse. I really hope I can get a photo of this horse. So she was good enough to come to my driveway. We did a little photo shoot. So I chose this horse today in our slideshow because even though he's really pedigree-wise is a solid paint, he's very classically quarter horse in his conformation. He has this very sloping croup in the hindquarters, and then he has very muscular build, as you can see. They tend to be fairly tall, not quite as tall as the thoroughbred breeds, but they tend to have this straight neck and often white blazes on their face. This is considered a sorrel horse, kind of an all-over warm reddish brown color horse, and they often have socks. They're used in barrel racing and ranching and rodeos and just working ranches on the west, Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, and all the states where they have a lot of these competitions and working ranches. So quarter horses are actually the most popular breed in the world today. And the quarter horse breed was developed out of one of the grandsons of the original thoroughbred stallions. And the name of that particular horse was Janus, and he was bred with the Native American horses, and they created this quarter horse breed. And so these are the kind of the quintessential horse that was born in America and has this working ranch conformation. This is the conformation that you see in contemporary Western art and Southwestern art, in all of these kind of Southwestern scenic images where you see horses. They're either quarter horses or paints and Appaloosas variations of the quarter horse conformation with maybe different coloring. But this is a very typical horse used again in contemporary Southwestern art. This is the work of Maura Allen. She's a contemporary artist who does these Southwestern scenes of the American West, and she also does these kind of high contrast, formally, these high contrast images. She takes her photographs, she says, by looking into the sun so that she can get these kind of silhouettes, and then she does these paintings. She works in acrylic, but on wood and glass and metal, to create these kind of almost silkscreen looking images. But she's a painter, pretty prominent painter in Southwestern art, Western art today. One of her works was the official poster for the Cheyenne Frontier Days not too long ago. I really like her work. Very beautiful relationships between hues. And again, we see this very typical kind of developed quarter horse, Western working quarter horse that we see today in the American West, much different again from Frederick Remington's Spanish Mustangs. So here's one of Susan Rothenberg's horses. This is Butterfly from 1975. So again, she did these horses from about 1975, 1980. And in fact, if you're living in Chicago or can get to Chicago within the next few weeks, if you see this video as soon as I post it, there's a show at Richard Gray Gallery right now of her horse work, which is downtown Chicago. And I think it would be worth seeing the works in person. She's very painterly, a lot of aggressive mark making, and you see this use of symbolism in her work, and a lot of her works have this very almost uncomfortable looking peachy pinky kind of color, and mixed with blacks, and you can see the underpainting of the lighter colors coming through. Very beautiful works. But again, this is an artist who said that she would have liked to have used the figure, but it was so unpopular for her during the time that she was working that she felt like she had to use the horse as kind of a stand-in for the figure in her own self-exploration. These are again kind of self-portraits for her. This is the work of Debra Butterfield, and she's a contemporary sculptor. These are very large-scale works. She does a few pieces that are not larger than life, but the works of hers that I've seen tend to be slightly larger than life. And she's also an equestrian, and I feel that that experience that she's had riding the horse has also really contributed to her sensitivity as a sculptor, because if you've ridden a horse and you have become sensitive to where the mass of the horse is in their muscle structure and how that changes when they shift their weight, for instance, you can articulate much better, as she has done as a sculptor, where these particular pieces of metal, the weight of that metal, are concentrated in her work, in this particular work. So anyway, this is a very gifted artist, very sensitive artist. I really love her work. And she is another one who says that she uses the horse form as a metaphor for herself as a self-portrait in terms of self-portraiture, but also in a social, political way, making a statement about feminism. She says these are mares, female horses, and their size and their grace and their strength is a statement that she's making with her work. So that's the end of our slideshow. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks a lot for joining me.